On the frigid morning of February 12th, 2025, the silence of Montana's snow-covered desert was shattered by the piercing whistle of an approaching train. Its metallic roar echoed off the ice-encrusted rails that stretched across the vast, desolate landscape, where only the wind and a scattering of trees dared to disturb the stillness. At that very moment, an unimaginable tragedy unfolded on the tracks. A massive grizzly bear, her imposing figure a blend of awe and terror, struggled desperately against the heavy chains binding her body. Her thick fur, typically gleaming with natural luster, was matted with blood and grime, vivid scars of the cruel treatment she had endured. Beside her trembled three tiny cubs, their small paws pressed against the frozen ground, their large, dark eyes brimming with fear as they darted between their mother and the steel monster hurtling toward them. The earth beneath their feet quaked with increasing force, the train's vibrations growing stronger, as if heralding the inevitable. But then, in a fleeting moment, the bear ceased her struggle. She froze, her breath heavy and ragged, and in a heart-wrenching gesture, turned to her cubs. With a tenderness that seemed almost human, she brushed each one with her muzzle, as if bidding them farewell, accepting a fate that appeared inescapable. Her gaze was steeped in pain, yet it held no anger, only a desperate plea for salvation she no longer anticipated. A few hundred meters away stood James Wilson, a wildlife photographer with 20 years of experience. His hands, usually steady with a camera, shook uncontrollably, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. What had begun as a routine morning, capturing the sunrise over the Bitterroot Mountains, had morphed into a nightmare. Through his telephoto lens, he witnessed a scene that defied belief. A grizzly bear and her cubs chained to the rails, as if sacrificial victims of a sinister plot. "My God," he whispered, his heart clenching with horror and helplessness. James was no stranger to the wild. Over the years, he had observed bears in their natural habitat, understood their strength and unpredictability, especially a mother guarding her young. But what he saw before him was more than just a bear. It was a mother whose life, and the lives of her little ones, hung by a thread. Without a second thought, he raced down the steep slope, his boots slipping on the ice, driven by a single, relentless thought. Someone had done this deliberately. The chains binding the bear were old and rusted, relics of the bygone logging industry. This was no accident. It was a cold, calculated act of malice. Rescue on the brink. By the time James reached the tracks, the train was perilously close, its headlights sliced through the morning mist, its whistle blaring like a death knell. The bear fixed her gaze on him, and in her eyes, he saw not a threat, but a supplication. That look stirred a memory from another night, the night his wife Sarah died, when their son Michael had stared at him with the same powerless desperation. Back then, James couldn't fix anything, but now he refused to surrender. Pulling his multi-tool from his pocket, he set to work. His fingers, numb from the cold, fumbled with the locks, but he pressed on. "Hold on," he shouted, knowing full well the bear couldn't comprehend his words. Suddenly, she shifted, and James instinctively flinched, bracing for an attack. But instead, she stretched her neck forward, bringing the chain closer to him. Their eyes met again, and in that fleeting moment, an unspoken bond formed between man and beast, two parents united by the primal urge to protect their own. With a sharp click, the first lock gave way. James hurried to the next, his movements growing frantic. The train was mere hundreds of yards away, its heat palpable even at that distance. The second lock released, and the bear thrashed violently, aiding in loosening the remaining restraints. Finally, with one last desperate yank, the chains fell free. Without hesitation, she seized one cub in her jaws and bolted. James, acting on instinct, scooped up the other two and raced downhill, ignoring every fiber of his being that screamed to flee the other way. The train roared past, missing them by inches. James tumbled into the snow, rolling through brush and ice until he landed heavily on the ground. For a moment, all was a whirlwind of sound and pain. Then he felt the cubs wriggling in his arms. They were alive. A few meters away, the bear rose shakily, still clutching her own cub. She waited as James gently set the little ones down. He did so slowly, stepping back, expecting her to charge. But she didn't attack. Instead, She stood by until her cubs rejoined her, then lifted her gaze to him. In her dark eyes, James saw something he took for gratitude before she led her family into the shelter of the forest. Left alone in the snow, James felt a surge of rage boiling within him. Someone had chained these bears to the tracks, dooming them to certain death. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a deliberate act of evil. He would find those responsible, no matter the cost. Shadows of the past and the quest for truth. James staggered to his feet, his muscles aching from the ordeal, but he couldn't afford to rest. Following the bear's tracks through the snow, he noticed drops of blood. Her wounds were worse than he'd realized. The thought that someone had subjected her to prolonged torment fueled his anger. He pulled out his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to the wildlife authorities, the second to his son Michael, with whom he hadn't spoken in days. "Michael, son, I need your help," he said, struggling to mask the tremor in his voice. "Something's happening here, something wrong, and I think it's tied to your new friends." The silence on the other end spoke louder than words. James knew then that his instincts were right. The tracks led him to a creek running through his own 10 acres of land, a plot he'd turned into an unofficial wildlife sanctuary after Sarah's death. What began as a way to cope with grief had grown into his mission, to save and restore life to the natural world. Now, this land became a haven for the bear and her cubs. They had taken refuge in a shallow cave by the water, and James approached cautiously, making soft noises to avoid startling them. The bear lay there, breathing heavily, her chain-inflicted wounds deep and raw, with older scars telling a tale of weeks, perhaps months, of captivity. The cubs huddled against her, their tiny bodies quaking with fear and cold. James pulled a tranquilizer from his backpack, standard gear for his work. "I'm sorry, girl," he whispered, taking aim. The dart struck true, and the bear let out a low moan but didn't lash out. Instead, she gently nudged her cubs deeper into the cave before her eyes fluttered shut under the sedative's effect. He waited a few minutes, ensuring she was fully unconscious, before moving closer. The cubs whimpered but didn't flee. They were too young and too frightened to leave their mother's side. He worked swiftly, cleaning her wounds with supplies from his pack. They were worse than he'd feared. Some cuts already showed signs of infection. His phone buzzed, a text from Michael. "Dad, come now. Don't wait for school to end. There's something you need to know." James's stomach tightened. He wanted to call and demand answers, but he knew that with his son, as with wounded animals, rushing things wouldn't help. The unveiling of truth. Through the trees came the crunch of tires on gravel. His own truck approached. Michael must have grabbed the keys from the house. Smart kid. Together, father and son secured the bear in a tarp and used the winch to carefully load her into the truck bed. As they drove back to the sanctuary, Michael finally spoke. "It was Jake's idea," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He found them near his uncle's hunting cabin. Wanted to train them, make money showing them off to tourists, like in a circus." James gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles whitened. Jake said his uncle knew how to handle bears, but it all spiraled out of control when the mother stopped obeying. They decided to kill her. "So they chained them to the tracks?" James asked, forcing his voice to stay even. Michael nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I tried to stop them last night, Dad. I told them it was wrong, but Jake and his uncle, they've got something on me. Something Mom wouldn't want you to know." James pulled over and looked at his son. For the first time in months, he didn't see the sullen teenager who'd drifted away, but the scared boy who'd lost his mother too soon. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together," he said, pulling him into a tight embrace. "But first, the authorities. What Jake and his uncle did isn't just cruel, it's a crime." At the sanctuary, Maria, James's assistant, awaited them. She'd prepared a large enclosure for the bears. As they transferred the animals, Michael spilled the rest. How Jake had blackmailed him over a theft of pills from the hospital pharmacy the night Sarah died. It was a burden he'd carried for 3 years, and now it was finally breaking free. Redemption and hope. 2 days passed. The bear, whom they'd started calling Grace, began to recover. Her wounds healed with antibiotics, and the cubs, though thin, showed flickers of curiosity. James and Michael gathered evidence. Photos, GPS coordinates, records of Grace's injuries. When Sheriff Laura Martinez arrived with a wildlife crime investigator, Michael stepped forward. "I know who did it," he said, his voice steadier than his father expected. I was there from the start. He recounted how Jake found the bears, how he, along with two other teens, Lily Chan and Derek Martinez, the sheriff's nephew, helped capture them using stolen tranquilizers from Jake's Uncle Robert's veterinary supplies. Jake promised tourist money, but Grace resisted, shielding her cubs. So they decided to dispose of her. The sheriff listened in silence, her face hardening with each revelation. Michael showed Jake's messages, veiled threats to expose his secret. The night Mom died, I stole pills from the hospital. He confessed, meeting his father's eyes. Jake caught me and helped cover it up. He's been holding it over me ever since. James froze. He remembered that night. Michael vanished for hours and returned changed. He'd been too lost in his own grief to press him. Now he understood the weight his son had borne. That's enough for a warrant, the sheriff said, standing. Soon, police arrested Jake and his uncle Robert, whose veterinary license was revoked after years of illegal wildlife trafficking came to light. Lily and Derek faced justice too, but their families backed their resolve to make amends. The path to forgiveness. Over the following weeks, Michael, Lily, and Derek worked at the sanctuary under Maria's guidance. They cared for Grace and her cubs, learning to heal them and prepare them for the wild. What began as punishment became their salvation. Grace slowly trusted humans again, her fear giving way to calm. The cubs played, their natural curiosity resurfacing. One morning, Michael called his father to the enclosure. He was sketching Grace and her cubs, capturing their strength and wisdom. I want to remember her like this, he said. James nodded, pride swelling in his chest. This wasn't the desperate bear from the tracks. This was a mother reclaiming her life. A week later, Grace and her cubs were ready for release. The teens decided on a farewell ceremony, not just for the bears, but for themselves. Michael crafted a series of drawings, Lily wrote a study on grizzly behavior, and Derek built a feeding platform for their new home. A new dawn. The release morning dawned clear and warm. A convoy brought Grace and her family to a remote Montana valley. When the trailer door opened, the bear stepped into the sunlight, her fur gleaming with health. Her cubs followed, brimming with playful energy. Michael gave a speech about second chances, displaying his drawings, from the horror on the tracks to new life in the woods. Grace led her cubs to the creek, teaching them to catch trout as she should have months earlier. The humans watched, holding their breath, until the bears vanished among the trees. Michael left his drawings in a waterproof box by the feeding platform. For those who come after, he explained. This isn't really goodbye, is it? He asked his father, gazing at Grace's silhouette on a ridge. James smiled. No, son. It's just the beginning. The sanctuary awaited more animals to heal, more redemption stories to write. In the valley, a bear family started anew, part of a tale about light rising from darkness.